On today's World Insight, Britain's 5G ban on Huawei under the cover of national security, more than meets the eye, and a new strain in Cross-Strait Ties following a recent U.S. arms sale to Taiwan, countermeasures, and the future of relations. Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We begin today's program with Britain's ban on Huawei. The ban requires all UK telecommunication providers to stop buying new Huawei 5G equipment starting next year, and they must also remove all of 5G kits from their networks by the year 2027. This follows U.S. sanctions, which claim the Chinese tech giant poses a national security threat. Huawei did insist it's far from a threat, urging the UK government to reconsider the ban. It called the move politicized, giving in pressure from Washington rather than actual security concerns. Meanwhile, a British spokesman warns the ban could delay the country's 5G rollout by at least a year. Still, Huawei says it will continue working with the UK to build a better connected Britain. So, is the UK's ban on Huawei politically motivated? What's the impact on global 5G competition? We are joined in Beijing by Jay Huang, founding partner of J Stone Capital and former managing director of Intel China. In London, Professor Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute and co-director of the Durandor Forum of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Begg, so you tell me, is it more politically motivated or for other reasons?
I think it is above all politically motivated, but I can identify three overlapping motives in what's been decided by Boris Johnson and his government. The first is intense pressure, both from across the Atlantic, with the Americans saying you must clamp down on Huawei, but also from many members of Boris Johnson's Conservative Party. The members of the House of Commons have been saying to him, we are suspicious of China in this regard. We don't believe Huawei's assurances that they are not connected to the state apparatus in China. The second motivation, I regret to say, is Hong Kong, because the British attitude to what's happening in Hong Kong has been very negative about China's role. And there's maybe a third motivation, which is more economic than political, and that is a concern not just in the UK, but across Europe, with something that's been called in European Commission circles strategic autonomy, being too dependent on a single supplier, in this case Huawei. Now, I don't quite understand this, because it means if we don't use Huawei, we become dependent on other suppliers in Sweden and Finland, Nokia and Ericsson.
I think I have to agree with Professor Beck's view. Clearly, it's political motivated, because from technology point of view, if anybody suspects Huawei or any telecommunication equipment vendors and network, whether they're secure or not, whether they have a backdoor or not, they can have ways to close so-called backdoors. Because for the telecommunication network, it consists of two parts. One is access network, the other one is a core network. And then you can, if you worry about Huawei or anybody, you can only ask Huawei to supply the access network, keep the core network to another party. Apparently, this time it's a ban of Huawei and everything. And so I can only draw the conclusion it's politically motivated.
I remember earlier the UK has been suggesting that 35% provided by Huawei and the cutting off Huawei from the most strategic areas. Mr. Huang, now obviously even that has been scrapped away at the latest decision.
I agree. That makes no economic sense whatsoever. And also I heard that the decision is, in a few years down the road, not only limited Huawei's supply to the new network or new contract, is actually eliminate Huawei's existing network at all. So this does not make any sense economically.
Mm. Of course, this is more to do with, Professor Begg, the U.S. relation with the U.K., or this is more to do with U.K.'s potential relation with China. Which one seems to be more important in the decision?
You know how I'm going to answer. You know how I'm going to answer by saying both. There is, let's face it, an intensifying economic Cold War going on between China and the US. And that economic Cold War is something Britain has to ultimately take a side on. We know the Americans, we're familiar with the Americans, we trade significantly more with the Americans than we do with China. And if it's a straight choice, Britain on the whole is always going to vote for China, for the US. Now, it should not be this kind of binary choice, but this is the political reality of it, and it's what is feeding this pressure coming from the Conservative members of Parliament on Boris Johnson to abandon Huawei, even though we recognize that it's going to have technological costs in slowing down the rollout of 5G.
And of course, the Chinese side reacted. According to Ambassador Liu Xiaoming, the Chinese ambassador to the UK, here's his latest quote from his Twitter. If you do not have an independent policy, you have to dance to the tune of other countries. I guess we all know which country is he referring to. He said, how could you claim to be, quote, Great Britain? Professor Begg, how do you think from now on the relation between China and the UK is likely to be regarding not just Huawei, but China's investment in the UK, China-UK cooperation, joint venture, developing markets in the third places, international cooperation? What do you make of the potential?
Well, I think we're in a very unfortunate position. It's captured very well in a cartoon in the Times newspaper this morning showing Boris Johnson on his knees in front of a sneering Donald Trump. But the hard economic facts in this are that we depend more on the US for foreign investment than China. Our export markets are more than twice as much the US as they are with China, and maybe even as much as 3 times if we get a new trade deal with the US. So the economic interest lies with the US so far and not with China. It's not an easy choice, and Boris Johnson has found himself in a quite impossible position in the middle of this economic Cold War.
What do you make of this choice made by the UK in terms of its future with 5G and also its streamline of industries, particularly telecom industries, in competition against all the other major telecom companies around the world?
I think Huawei is not the sole supplier of 5G networks. Without Huawei, and the UK operators can, use the equipment coming from Ericsson and Nokia. And these 2 parties, and actually it's a duopoly. Without third parties competing, and we know the UK and the European operators will have to pay much higher price without third party to compete into this dual monopoly and situation. However, as Professor Beck says, and the decision is not based on economic or technology merit. It's primarily a political one. So once you make a political decisions, and I don't think the economic impact would be put into consideration, unfortunately. It is extremely costly to replace one vendor's equipment by another vendor. Not to mention, the services may be disrupted and etc. Yeah. Usually, you just say, "I stop using your equipment, but I'll keep your equipment in the network for a very long time." Usually, the warranty is 15 years, and usually the operators let the vendor's equipment in the network and until the warranty expires.
On the other hand, Mr. Begg, how should we understand not only this banning Huawei in the UK, but also a series of decisions made by the UK related to how it carves itself about its future, and it carves itself about its relations with the outside world and the structure it wants to deal with the outside world. If I could quote Jim O'Neill, who is the former Treasury Minister under Mr. Cameron, of course, he said this: "The impetus to cut ourselves off from China seems to me a bit like weird self-imposed dilemmas that drove Brexit," end of quote. Now, whether you like his comparison or not is one question, but exactly what is the logic now UK is operating in terms of its political decisions, in terms of its geopolitical policies, in terms of its structure to deal with the rest of the world? Many examine it again with this one decision about Huawei.
Leaving the European Union fully by the end of this year, trying to decide where its future lies vis-à-vis other parts of the world, seeking comprehensive trade deals, both with the European Union and all the other range of potential trading partners. And it sees the US as by far the biggest prize economically at the moment, because China runs trade surpluses with most parts of the world. The size of the Chinese market for the UK is relatively small compared with European partners. So if you have to make a choice in this economic war between China and the US, the logic of the position that's being articulated is it's in Britain's self-interest to be allied with the country it trades most with, which is the US, rather than China. It's that hard choice that's the basis for this economic dilemma. And if I may just add a footnote on the Huawei equipment, I heard several telecoms leaders last night saying they were relatively optimistic about the 7-year period. They were relieved to find it was 7 years and not an immediate withdrawal of the equipment. They think that's normal replacement cycles.
There's a lot of political calculations as well as economic articulations, it seems, at least behind the decision. Having said that, though, what about Huawei, Mr. Huang? You're not insider to the Huawei company, I understand, but to you, a tech person looking at the tech company facing difficulties starting from last year's China-US trade war, how is Huawei doing? We know that Huawei just came out with the latest first half year 2020 report, suggesting 13.1% rise in revenue in the first half of the year. But if you take a closer look at the numbers, it is still the growth rate down from 23.2% in the first half of 2019. Of course, first half of 2019, geopolitically speaking, is much safer than what it is today for Huawei. So, but the question really is, Mr. Huang, where is Huawei going? Can Huawei still stand still?
Well, if you look at the report, Huawei comes out, and it looks so far so good. But as Huawei's report says, this is their own report. It's not audited at all. We need to wait to see, and the UK is the first, maybe European countries and to ban the Huawei 5G equipment. We need to wait to see what about the other companies. And as we all know, Huawei's network business, probably over 50% of them coming from overseas. And if Europe as a whole ban Huawei's equipment, then Huawei has a couple of other choices. One is turning to domestically, and another one is to try to sell their equipment to somewhere else and outside China.
Now we know the National Security Advisor and the Deputy National Security Advisor of the United States are both inside Europe, trying to persuade U.S. counterparts in Europe to ban Huawei and to stand from the other side against China, to decouple from China, follow this administration's policy. But Mr. Begg, Professor, from your knowledge about the interesting map of the EU, for example, France, Germany particularly, how will these capitals react? And their reactions to the U.S. call to decouple from China, how will that reflect it to the UK in terms of its own nature of policy making?
Well, the first thing to say is that Huawei is an extraordinary and innovative company, and there's nothing quite like it in Europe at the moment. That said, the difficulty that all governments are going to face is that there is a concern about over-reliance on China in certain supply chains. This expression I mentioned earlier, strategic autonomy, refers to the fact that you do not want to be overly dependent on a supplier from one source for strategic materials, be it telecoms or more recently the health and other equipment that was being solicited during the worst of the pandemic. So there is a strong move across Europe to increase its independence of major suppliers, and that's going to be reflected in Huawei. Then there is the American pressure. The American pressure is going to be immense.
Mr. Huang, from a technical perspective, what does that mean for 5G? According to earlier plans, illustrated, articulated by all the telecom companies, tech companies around the world, many of the names we already mentioned in our earlier discussion, we are now almost at the doorstep of 5G, and we're just a few steps away from it. And we're supposed to have a splendid life with driverless cars, with AI, with the Internet of Things, all benefiting from it. And we're going to enjoy our lives. Are we going to be as close to 5G world as we should? Or politics really now is going to delay us from that process?
Well, I think the impact of this geopolitics on 5G is still too early to tell. Because if you look at the 5G suppliers on the telecommunications side of it, Huawei is one of the leaders, but it's not the only one who can supply the 5G equipment. For example, in Korea, the 5G network has been put up and in operation by primarily Korean and telecom equipment vendors without Huawei in there. So that says that without Huawei, other telecom equipment vendors can provide 5G network and without Huawei. However, we are in a situation, the global supply chains are intertwined and globally. You can ban Huawei. You can use, for example, Ericsson or Nokia's equipment. But within Ericsson, Nokia equipment, some of the components may come from China as well. And if we continue going down this path, we're going to see unfortunate situation is one world, two systems. And then you separate out and the whole supply chain. I think that impact is a lot bigger than just to 5G services globally.
So you're saying, Mr. Huang, that we still do not know whether 5G could be a success if further geopolitics divide us, particularly having its impact on global supply chain. Is that what you're trying to say? We still do not know whether we can really enjoy 5G anymore.
Well, what I'm trying to say, if this trending or logic continue going down, the impact is not only 5G, will be to other areas. For example, medical side of it. As we all know, lots of chemical, lots of the medical components or supplies also coming from China as well. If you want to ban the whole thing, and the impact is globally. Likewise, lots of things that China also depending on the world. If this and the interdependency has been cut off, the impact is more than just on 5G. It's a globally and also on the global economy.
Professor Begg, before we go, I do want to ask you about one thing. Of course, the UK has to think about its own future as a result of some of the latest decisions, including Brexit. But the UK is also a country that has been enjoying some legendary history if you look at the West as a whole. So this time, what role will the UK play once we could look at things in retrospect, including this decision on Huawei? Will be very interesting, isn't it, Professor Begg?
Very much so. I share Mr. Huang's view that 5G is going to happen. There's no question of that. Business will ensure it happens. It just may be slower and less comprehensive than it might be if there were no frictions arising from the politics. Where the UK goes next is quite uncertain because the draw is from across the Atlantic. What's less clear is how Britain, as a relatively small to middle-ranking international power, is going to engage with the rest of the world after full Brexit. We wait to see how that happens. You know from our previous conversations that I am not in favor of Brexit. I think it's a bad decision. But it's happened, and now Britain is in the process of redefining a global role.
Very interesting. Mr. Huang, with a decision made by the UK regarding Huawei, will there be a domino effect? Or will there be just an exceptional case? That would be a very interesting thing to look, isn't it?
Yes, and absolutely. Another thing is, and one decision has been made. The decision maker have their intended goals to accomplish. History tells very often there were some unexpected consequences may popping up, which is not exactly what the decision maker had in their mind.
Could I add in relation to that a very obvious unexpected consequence is that if you freeze out Huawei from being able to purchase inputs from the US chips, then Huawei is going to develop its own. So you create a new competitor for the US as an unintended consequence of trying to stop the competitor.
Exactly. We already see this is happening in China's semiconductor side of it. You know, Huawei is banned for using U.S. companies' chips. Now the other companies, the Chinese company, everybody is worried and they're wondering who will be the next. So the unexpected consequences, as Professor Beck says, you know, now we see a lot of small startups in the semiconductor side of it. They see this is a booming opportunity for them to fill in the gap, to provide their own chips, selling to Huawei and other Chinese and overseas vendors. This is what I call unexpected consequences.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what will happen next. It's already quite a world of drama every day. Thank you so much, both of you gentlemen, helping us to understand from different perspectives. Professor Ian Begg in London, Jay Huang in Beijing. Really appreciate it, and be well. You're watching World Insight. Coming up on our program, new strain in Cross-Strait Ties following a recent U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, countermeasures, and the future of relations after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. Next, let's take a look at the Cross-Strait Ties. Tensions new as Taiwan carries out a 5-day live-fire drill this week. This after the U.S. approved another arms sales to Taiwan last week. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says it will sanction Lockheed Martin for its involvement in Washington's latest arms sale. The company is the main contractor for an upgrade package for Taiwan's Patriot surface-to-air missiles. China insists the U.S. to stick to the joint communique, stating there is only one China and Washington should not make Taiwan a leverage against China. Meanwhile, amid the COVID-19 pandemic, Taiwan is busy exploring ways to meet new challenges. So how will cross-strait ties likely evolve? Let's loop in our panelists from Beijing and Taipei. For more on Cross-Strait Ties, we are joined in Beijing, Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. In Taipei, Joanna Lei, former legislator. Welcome to both of you. I want to start by asking about the latest situation regarding military exercises in the South China Sea and its relations to the situation and stability across the Taiwan Straits. Professor Yang, your thoughts, briefly.
I think the latest arms sale to Taiwan is just one of the measures Trump administration has launched against China, ranging from the political, economic, and the arms sale to Taiwan, challenging to the core interests of China. All the combined measures are designed to launch the so-called comprehensive strategic communication against China to terminate the process of the rising China at the ultimate goal.
While China and the United States relations between the two getting ever more unpredictable, Ms. Lei, what does that mean for all of you who are trying to make sure that Taiwan society is going into the right direction?
Well, certainly there is a very clear triangular relationship between China, the United States, and the situation across Taiwan Straits. So as U.S. is intensifying its quote-unquote strategic competition with mainland China, Taiwan is oftentimes used as a major case in point in the forefront of the so-called freedom or democracy fight. So Taiwan is now pushing into an increasingly strong tension across the Taiwan Straits, not necessarily by a local pro-independence movement, but more so by the United States' intentional use of Taiwan as a lever. So we are certainly very concerned and would hope that nothing of the negative future will happen to the people in Taiwan.
That's an interesting analogy, Ms. Lei, you just used. Obviously, it shows that a certain kind of courting was happening, but at the same time, the U.S. could kick Taiwan away at any time when it's at its benefit. So tell me more about the latest arms sales. Lockheed Martin has been punished, quote-unquote, by the Chinese side, by Beijing. What is the reaction in Taiwan, and how do you think that's likely to impact future interactions with Washington?
This time, both the 620 million sales of recertification and the earlier sale of the torpedo are done through a very different way. These are announced by DSCA, seen as a way of routine, regular sale of military-related articles. Mm-hmm. So this is probably a new normal that we've never seen before. But now it's all in piecemeal, in a regular move, and announced by DSCA. So I think we're going into a new normal and probably going into deeper water at this time.
What does that mean, the new normal, if I could?
Well, they are changing the mode of arms sales to Taiwan. Instead of, in the past, there would be a major annual review and debate on the articles and authorized by the Congress. Now it's going through a more, quote-unquote, normal sales process and announced by DSCA. I think this is something that we should definitely pay attention to, because not only are these articles pertinent to the increasing tension across Taiwan Strait and pertinent to the likely scenario of if there were a war. I always use if because I hate to see this happen. But the likely scenario of needing air defense and needing underwater submarine defense. So not only are these articles important, but also the sales. The supply mechanism is also different. And this is the legacy of Randy Schreiber and his other colleagues.
Professor Yang from Beijing, so listening to your colleague from Taiwan, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Really, China, quote-unquote, punishing Lockheed Martin, which is selling arms to Taiwan? Is it more a gesture, or is it really likely to lead to a series of actions coming from Beijing?
Well, I think at this moment, as a first step, I think it's really a signature or gesture. Say the symbolic meaning is greater than the substantive meaning. But at this moment, But if you look at the second and the third and the following process, I'm afraid with the potential extension of the related tensions, I think the damaging of U.S. interests will be increased. For example, according to Americans' sanction logic, they have the first level sanction and second level sanction, say the secondary boycott. Now, Beijing hasn't launched a measure relating to the so-called secondary boycott. What does it mean by secondary boycott? That means all the third parties has a business relation with Lockheed Martin will be involved in the sanction scope. So if Beijing go into that step, that will mean the symbolic sanction will step into the substantive level. But if Beijing go to the secondary boycott, that will involve lot of business, both in the United States and business in the third country.
Yeah.
So basically, China at this moment is cautious, but that doesn't mean China will not dare to go into the deeper step and just follow the U.S. Logic and measures. I think this is really a potential risks. But I think that's not the more important. That's not the important matter. The more important thing is this time the arms sale to Taiwan, as I mentioned earlier, is just a part of the total strategic approach against China. Relating to the triangle relation, yes, that is a long phenomenon, but that is not a typical triangle relation in international relations.
Okay.
In fact, Taiwan has been a playing card with the U.S. So the triangle relation between the three sides is actually the 2+1. Taiwan as a card in the U.S. strategic hand.
Earlier, Ms. Lei, we have heard from those now in power in Taiwan, suggesting that they are ready to scrap off the economic agreement Taiwan reached with the mainland. Now, that agreement, in fact, has been benefiting people in Taiwan, particularly farmers and many others, for years. So when you see signs of that, what does that mean? What does that mean politically also on the island of Taiwan?
ECFA was signed over 10 years ago. At that time, it was an extreme show of good faith, giving Taiwan's service sector an advantage, a head-on advantage over other nations, other economies. But over the last 10 years, the mainland China has opened up its market. So a lot of the advantages given to Taiwan through ECFA is now universal, given to other places. In addition to that, mainland China sector, the business sector, service sector, have improved and caught on with the international standards. Therefore, I think ECFA doesn't have a very strong potential to benefit Taiwan businessmen, and it does have a very strong, significant sort of symbolic meaning if Taiwan does decide to cease to function, which is a word that the government has used in the past, or abolish ECFA. It's sending an extreme chilling effect to Taiwanese businessmen, students, and people living in mainland China, but also sending an extremely chilling effect to the business community.
Meanwhile, how is Taiwan looking at its role on the global supply chain? Earlier, Taiwan and China's mainland been working very closely, for example, about providing devices to the Apple phone. We have seen Foxconn, which is originally a company coming from Taiwan, doing so well with their mainland counterparts to do its job, and they have factories all over China. So, Ms. Lei, how do you see Taiwan is carving out its own role in the global supply chain while the latter is changing dramatically? How will that, of course, which is very crucial, having its impact on Taiwan's relations with the mainland and also on Taiwan's articulation about how it should deal with the relations between China and the United States?
Unfortunately, Taiwan's business community will have to adopt to the new boundary conditions. It is very clear that there may be a decoupling of the U.S. and mainland China, not only in terms of trade and finance, but also in terms of technology. U.S. has put very strong restrictions to even Taiwanese business development, technology development companies in the United States by forcing them to choose between the two sides. So it is clear that as the market is being redefined, with boundary conditions redefined, Taiwanese businessmen will have to think about a potential that it will no longer work on a one universal global supply chain that would benefit all markets and all people in the world. It probably will have to look at two separate supply chains. One is dominated by the United States and its rules, and the other will be actually strongly driven by the PRC market and its market conditions. So people are still trying to scramble and find out how to navigate the new uncharted water at this time.
Right.
So in terms of how to move forward, in terms of Taiwan's narrative, I certainly see a benefit of Ma Ying-jeou's era when he tried to maintain a, using a more current word, a social distance across the giants. But certainly the current DPP government has decided to side with the United States and Japan. So I think we shouldn't underlook the importance of Japan and its influence on the current DPP government. So when the current DPP government decided to side with the United States and Japan, it loses its strategic leverage, and in fact, it loses its strategic distance.
Another thing I really want to ask the both of you is that COVID-19 has changed a lot. Now, how long a term that it will have an ultimate impact on our world, we do not know. And exactly what the impacts are, we cannot figure out at this moment. But what we know, for example, Ms. Lei, is that Northeast Asia are in fact doing relatively well in terms of its prevention and control, particularly at this stage. We see China, Taiwan of China, Hong Kong of China, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and some of the other key places are doing relatively well. However, in North America, particularly the United States, things are getting really concerning, which could mean the border will not be able to open, at least across the Pacific, that efficiently in the near future. So this certainly will also have an impact on interactions, on trade, on communication, and on exchanges. So these are immediate, but at the same time crucial facts that will have an impact. Ms. Lei, what is your articulation about this factor, and how will it work with the earlier mentioned geopolitical, economic, and social factors that we already know about Taiwan and its relations with the others?
There is no denial that we are in a global pandemic, which is also a global crisis, cutting across all spheres, as Tianwei just described. So as all governments try to scramble to address this issue, different places have taken different strategies. The Asian model, as you described earlier, actually is built on 3 or 4 major pillars. One is very strong centralized government initiative. Second is very strong social fabric network that allows the implementation of the somewhat restrictive measures. And the third one is individual attitudes toward self-sacrifice and helping others. All 3 are not present at the United States at this point. So I think this is a true test of the strength of society, the robustness of different systems, and also will be a true test of who recovers from this global crisis the earliest, the fastest, and come out the strongest. So we don't know what the future is, as we're still navigating the uncharted water, but hopefully at the end of this uncharted water, we will find a new territory where Asia emerge as the stronger, faster, and more adaptive area, region as a whole.
I see.
So I'm still hopeful, even though we're looking at a global issue and very massive threats to humanity.
Thank you. And last point also coming from you, Mr. Yang, about that. The immediate and how is that interacting with geopolitical, social, and economic factors?
Well, let me put it by this way. At this moment, we cannot say the measures and plans dealing with COVID-19 have produced different models, American model, European model, US Asian model. We cannot say that, but the simple fact is, in general, the recovery of East Asia is go faster than the other regions else in the world. That will logically leading to the faster or earlier recovery of economic activities in this region.
Yeah, we'll see whether that's likely to happen. Yang Xiyu, Joanna Lei, thank you so much, and be well. And that's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can certainly search our program World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.